my name's Paul Turner. I'm a nature warden on a nature reserve in the north of Scotland that's run by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds.
My name's Claire Foote and I'm also a warden on the RSPB reserve at Forsinard, a peatland reserve. I'm involved a lot with volunteers on the reserve, so quite often people that have finished university and are looking to get experience out on a nature reserve.
So Forsinard the Forsinard Reserve's about 21,000 hectares, so it's the biggest RSPB nature reserve in the UK, and it's located in an area known as the Flow Country, which is a kind of wetland area in the very north of Scotland. So we're actually closer to Iceland than we are to London. So it's quite a remote part of the UK.
And to give a little bit of scale, still British scale, but if you move the reserve down a bit lower down in Scotland, its furthest west point would be in Glasgow and its furthest east point would be in Edinburgh. So that's sort of the scale that we're looking at.
Great. So on a day-to-day, what do you do on the reserve?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, so no one day is the same, which is partly why I wanted to do this job, and it's very varied being a warden on a nature reserve. In the breeding season, so April to end of July, when the birds are there, we're quite often surveying the birds, and there's different ways of doing that depending on the birds' habits and the habitat that you're in. So if we're monitoring the bigger birds of prey, the raptors, then we'll maybe sit in one spot and watch them for a certain amount of time, and if it's a wading bird, then there's a different technique again. We're doing a lot of peatland restoration, so the north of Scotland peatlands where we are, quite a lot of them got planted with invasive conifers. It was a tax break thing. We could take up a whole talk on that. So a lot of our work is about trying to remove those trees and restore the peatlands, because the habitat is a really important carbon store when it's not damaged, and also the birds and other wildlife that live there are quite rare in the UK, so we need to restore the habitat so that they can come back. So we do things like monitoring the water level, doing vegetation surveys to see if the plant species are coming back, and looking at the insects, because it's very much although the charity we work for has birds at the end, it's been around for over 100 years, the charity, but we're very much about all nature and the whole ecosystem. So, you know, we need to get the water levels back, we need to get the invertebrates back and the plants so that all the other species can come back. The birds aren't going to come back if we don't sort everything else out. Then in the winter, well, not the winter, the non-bird breeding season, that's when we can do the practical management work. So from August through to the end of February, we'll be doing things like with volunteer work parties, removing some of the smaller trees or the little saplings that have come back. And when we talk about removing the bigger trees, that's a lot of what Paul focuses on. So I'll hand back over to him.
Yeah. Although we both have the same job title, we do very different things. There's some overlap. We both do a bit of survey and a bit of monitoring work. But I kind of line manage and oversee the sort of harvesting operations. So where some of the regen control is done with chainsaws and brush cutters, hand tools, we take out large areas of forestry as well with commercial companies. So we get them in with harvesters and forwarding machines to take those out. So I look after the sort of day-to-day oversight of that and the sort of safety side of it from the reserve perspective as well. And I mean, we use a lot of GIS mapping. We use drones for aerial imagery. We have used drones for aerial mapping as well. So it's very much about sort of using sort of technology to help us monitor these sort of large sort of landscape scale projects. And then what Claire was talking about in terms of hydrological restoration, some of that is about blocking old forestry drains to retain the water on site and to re-wet the peatland. And as part of that, we also have to deal with residual forestry material. So although we cut down the trees and the trees go away as a product, we're left with a lot of branches and just brash left behind. And so we need to either chip that and remove it from site or mulch it on site. So there are a variety of different treatments that we can carry out to try and restore these forested areas back to something that is a bit more near natural than we had before.
And we have to look at a long-term vision, because these trees were only planted in the 1960s and 70s, so like in our parents' lifetimes, but it's going to take tens to hundreds of years to restore, and it will go back to perhaps performing like it used to, but it won't ever be exactly like it used to before the trees. It wasn't like they delicately planted trees in, because it's a peatland, a swamp type area. They had to industrially put drains in so that it got drier. So that's why when Paul and I are talking about monitoring water levels, we put in, peat dams and things to hold the water back, to try and get the water level back up. On a healthy peatland, the water should be no more than this level below the surface, if not higher, sometimes over the surface. And in some places where we haven't managed to block any water, the water, you can go down over a metre and you haven't found the water table.
Yeah, so it's quite a lot of damage to it that's been done, not just through forestry, but through old agricultural drainage around the sort of World War II and before. There was a big drive in the UK to make unproductive land, more useful, either for sort of grazing animals normally, or attempts at growing things, which don't work very well, because it's not that easy to drain a blanket bog. And you get different types of bog as well. And what we're talking about is blanket bog. It's a layer across the landscape. So after the last glacial period, the glaciers strip everything back to sort of bare rock, and then what you get is a formation of peat, and that's formed through the sphagnum mosses that don't decompose. So it's anaerobic decomposition. And then you get this layering of peat that builds up over thousands of years. And it's the climate that we had at the time, and that we still have at the moment, that allows that to form. So there's over 10 metres of peat depth out in various parts of the reserve. And the peat only forms at 1 millimetre per year, so it takes thousands of years. And that's why when Claire's saying it takes time hundreds of years to restore, it can get damaged very easily, but because it's very slow development, it takes those hundreds of years to then be able to repair it again.
When we said about unproductive land, the thing that's been really good for getting funding for the work on our nature reserve at the moment is the real acceleration in carbon research and carbon science and climate change in the last 10 years. So we've been able to access more UK and European funding to help with climate change, because if we can restore the peatlands, then they act as a really good carbon sink. But if they're damaged, then they'll emit carbon. So that's been really helping us.
Yeah. So that's a large part of what we do, and then on top of that is a whole host of other things, like Claire said, managing volunteers and engaging with the public and doing education work.
Because engaging with the public is so important, because if we want the same not to happen in the future, that people think the land's unproductive, then we need to educate people on why it's important and get them to love it as well.
The problem with the forestry is that a lot of people just assume that forestry is positive, and that simply planting trees is going to solve all of our problems. But the wrong type of trees in the wrong place can actually be far more destructive. And it makes it less biodiverse on the bog if you just have these plantations that are all just 2 species of tree, and then a very narrow range of other wildlife and natural elements that can exist there. So, yeah.
Are there any birds and wildlife that are only found in that region, and that's why it's so critical to maintain the habitat and the ecosystem? Or is it a breeding ground, a migration stop? What type of species and wildlife do you have there?
So a lot of the stuff that we have in the north of Scotland is sort of upland species. So our kind of key breeding waders are golden plover, dunlin, greenshank. And a lot of those are similar to what we saw in Iceland. So you get dunlin and golden plover in Iceland as well. They like those sort of cold northern extremes. So you will find similar species in other sort of northern regions. We have 2 different species of divers. So I think what in North America you call loons. So we've got red-throated diver and black-throated diver, which are key breeding species for us as well.
I have a lot of work to do with the birds of prey and the raptors, and the flow country is particularly important. Not at the risk of not being too controversial, it's particularly important in the UK because it's a stronghold for some of those raptors. They don't face persecution in the flow country that they face in some other areas of the UK at the moment.
Yeah. So there's a suite of kind of key species, but we have European otter as well, which the reserve has multiple designations. So it's a national nature reserve. It has multiple special sites of scientific interest. It has designations for special protection areas and special areas of conservation. So it's quite a highly designated area, and adjacent areas to the reserve have part of these designations as well. So it's part of this kind of broader jigsaw, and at the moment they're trying to push for the flow country as a whole to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So if we got that designation as well, then that would help protect it. So it's a natural designation that they're going for UNESCO. And that's being championed by a partnership of organisations, of which the RSPB is part of that.
What type of knowledge and skills do you need in order to be a warden, and what do you do?
Very interestingly, one of our volunteers is just going through the entry process to university and phoned Paul and I for some advice the other day. She's been volunteering for us since she was 15. She's now 18, and we were saying to her that she's been doing all the right things already. It's very good. I have a degree in geography, but what we look for is the transferable skills as well, and the things that we can't teach. We can teach you how to use a brush cutter, or as they call them in America, a weed whacker. But we can't teach you how to have the right disposition to be able to enthuse other people, or explain work to other people. So I think I learned a lot of my technical knowledge through paid contracts and then volunteering.
Yeah, I think the good thing about the conservation sector in the UK is that there's no one route into it. So you can have quite a varied background to coming into it. So my original degree is business, IT and multimedia. But I then did a higher national certificate in countryside and environmental management. So any kind of biological qualification, not necessarily a degree, but some kind of further study that gives you a baseline in either ecology, biology, geography, is helpful, and gives you a greater understanding. It's not, I wouldn't say it's essential, but it's helpful and then based on that is a lot of practical experience. And normally that builds through volunteering into temporary contracts or short-term contracts, and then more permanent kind of paid posts. But and it's certainly that, like Claire said, the soft skills, the enthusiasm, the passion for nature and for the environment, for species that are out there, that especially those that are sort of critically endangered. That the right attitude is really important, and those are the sort of things that quite often we can't teach. So it's quite a kind of varied way of getting into it.
And I guess my first degree, which was in geography and history, continued my enthusiasm for the natural world and conservation and wildlife. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I finished. I just knew I wanted to help save the planet. So it was quite broad. And then I stayed on at that university and did a master's in environmental politics. And then, like Paul, I didn't go straight into conservation, but that had given me the sort of broad view of where I wanted to go. And then the more I volunteered and the more I learned, I knew I wanted to help in wildlife conservation. But by doing the geography at university, that really helped me. It still kept me really interested in these kind of processes and things.
Yeah, I mean, although I didn't do geography at university, I did do geography at high school, and we had a very good geography teacher who was very enthusiastic and really helped to kind of link the real world into geography for me, and it was one of the subjects I did pretty well in, and I put that down to the fact that the teacher was very enthusiastic and really gave you the extra time to help you understand that it's not just maps and things like that, but actually it's about people and how people interact with the world, and how we kind of are almost custodians of it as well.
What is geography to you?
Oh, on you.
So,
you've got the degree.
When I don't know if this happens in the States, but sometimes when you tell people you've got a degree in geography, they're like, oh, that's like a nothing subject. And it's not a nothing subject. It's kind of a really broad subject, and that's why I love it, because my thesis was historical geography. But, you know, it's got geography, it's got psychology, it's got sociology, it's got ecology, it's got biology, and it very much meshes them all and shows you how they all work together, you know, when I was talking about ecosystems earlier. So I think geography is an amazing subject because, and I was going to say, I hope you and Paul don't feel I muscled in, but when he said what the topic was, I was like, I want to sing the praises of geography, you know, and it is a really good subject. And it let me do then the environmental politics, which was similarly philosophy, psychology, economics. So, you know, similarly broad, but you need to look at all these different aspects and how they knit together in the world. So I think geography is super.
My definition of geography, yeah, is before I did anything with it at school, I just had this image of maps and globes, and yeah, that's geography was places and names. But having done it at high school, it very much became more than that, and it was very much more about how humanity interacts with the world and vice versa, and the sort of dynamic change over time. Having worked in the job that I have here, geography to me also is technology. It's using technology to look at how we undertake processes. I mean, say we use GIS mapping software every single day, and I love maps, but also it's beyond that now. It's using aerial imagery, be that from drones or from software that we've purchased in with either satellite imagery or high level aerial imagery. And it's using that to plan restoration work, forestry removal, and to create documents that we use for our management work for it. So geography to me is also quite a practical tool that I kind of use every day to be able to do my job. And without those elements, it would be very difficult to explain to contractors what we want them to do, and funders why we're doing it and why we need their money. And so, yeah, geography, although we don't really think of it every day as being geography, it is there. It underpins everything that we kind of really do.
Well, one of my favourite bits of basic geography and like way back at the start of high school was the water cycle. And the peatlands that we work on are so dependent on water and the rain and things that, it's geography.
Do you mind expanding on how geography helps you in the field and in your job? Because Paul kind of talked about how he uses technology, and GIS has really been a key component in your job. But Claire, perhaps you can explain and expand a little bit more on your side.
I deal a lot with the farm that we have that's in the middle of the reserve. So that's interesting in terms of historical geography in Scotland with the clearances and the how farming changed in Scotland and why it changed, and also dealing with local people that still croft. So that's a bit of kind of human geography and understanding where people are coming from. The small scale farming in Scotland is very different to even where I grew up in England.
I was just going to say, sort of linked into that, the landscape that we work in, although today it looks like a very sort of empty, wild landscape, is not really the historical truth. And that if you looked at it going back 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, you would see a real difference in the terrain features and the habitats that were there. And so there has been a lot of changes to the landscape, and a lot of it is human geography. A lot of it is changes that people have made to that landscape over time. And today people kind of don't really, they kind of just look at it and think it's this big empty wilderness. But there are historical and archaeological features that you find out there all the time. But there are traces in the actual landscape itself of the things that people have been doing to it for that kind of period.
Another thing where geography is really simply evident, when I'm out on the reserve, we do some surveys, moorland bird surveys, where we do all day, say 6 to 7 hours a day, walking transects, monitoring the birds. And the peatlands is the first place I've really consciously noticed the lag time, talking about the water cycle again, because there's not much, it rains, and then the rivers and the streams rise really highly. So you're needing to have those sort of things in the back of your brain. If I walk across this stream, am I going to be able to get back across it to get back to the car to go home? So that's
without getting wet.
But that's why I needed to think about when I'm engaging my geography brain. And also, we're really lucky when life is more normal. We have residential volunteers that come and stay with us. And we've had them from Australia, from the States, from Canada, from across Europe. Yeah. So it's getting people from all over the world to appreciate this habitat, and also finding out about their perspectives on things. And I think a really big thing with hosting with volunteers is the people learn and they also give back, and then they take away. Quite often they email me that they're going to do a talk at their local college or something, and they have some slides. So it's getting the message out as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting working with the RSPB, because although we are a science-based organisation, and we always state that we don't just do things for the sake of it. So all of the land management practices we do have an element of monitoring to them, and they are that monitoring is evaluated. So we need to make sure that a land management technique will actually do what we want it to do. And sometimes we need to do that on a scale that we can try as an experiment, and then if that works, we can roll out on a larger scale. So although it's underpinned by science, it's actually geography that's helping us do it. And yet people probably just don't actually realise that. And land management on a landscape scale, which is kind of where we've gone in the UK, definitely within the last sort of 20, 25 years, is kind of becoming even more important. We used to, as an organisation, the RSPB had reserves scattered around the UK, but you start realising that if all you're ever doing is managing these little islands for nature and for wildlife, you're not impacting upon the surrounding landscape. And then you're just ending up with these isolated populations of things. So it becomes much more about looking at the broader landscape and other landowners, whether they're farmers or landowners or people's gardens or whatever, and then trying to influence the way that they manage for nature as well. And sometimes we have successes and sometimes we don't. But it is have that holistic look at it, and that is geography right there.
Paul, you do more than just being a warden. You wear many hats. So I thought maybe you can expand on some of the different roles that you play in your community and how geography is a part of all of those.
Yeah. So probably stuff with the Coast Guard is probably the easiest one to talk about. So I'm a volunteer rescue officer with HRM Coast Guard, which is slightly different to the US Coast Guard in that it is mainly there to sort of enforce the maritime policies rather than in any kind of sort of military type role or law enforcement role. The UK Border Force fulfills that separate sort of scenario, and the sector I'm kind of involved in is search and rescue. So the UK Coast Guard search and rescue kind of teams are small teams normally, except for in some of the more highly populated areas that are scattered all the way around the UK. So I think there's somewhere between 200 and 300 separate teams, and they form a network around the UK coast, and they are coordinated from sort of coordination centres, who will receive an emergency call, either over VHF radio, through flares, or over the sort of the normal phone network, and they will task appropriate resources to that emergency call. That could be land-based teams, which is what I do. Or it could be the sort of aviation side of it, the rescue helicopters. And in the UK, we have a separate charitable lifeboat service, the Royal National Lifeboat Institute, and they fulfil that sort of maritime rescue side of it. And they, again, are coordinated by the Coast Guard Coordination Centre. So it is, from a geography point of view, it's very much coastal. It's a kind of sort of network.
And the weather plays a huge influence on when you are out for rescues. Yeah,
the Scottish weather is pretty notorious, especially in the middle of winter. It's very changeable. It's not a stable weather system. We get a lot of very changeable weather.
And we actually live on the far north coast of Scotland. So we've got the Pentland Firth just to the north of us, which wrecked the Spanish Armada. So Paul can explain more about the Pentland and its dangers.
So the Pentland Firth is one of the most dangerous sort of stretches of water, certainly in the UK and Europe. It sits between the UK mainland, so obviously the UK being a very large island, and the smaller Orkney Islands to the north. And the tidal flow there between the Atlantic on one side and the North Sea on the other is pretty fierce, and it has been pretty notorious in both the past and present for wrecking shipping and causing problems. So it causes a lot of eddies and whirlpools, and it's quite a kind of difficult stretch of water. And we get call outs most of the time now. Actually, a lot of our call outs are land based, so it's people walking on the coast or kayaking or stand up paddle boarding, that kind of stuff, that get into difficulty. There's a big kind of surge at the moment in open water swimming and that kind of thing. but we do still get injuries on fishing vessels, and there's a lot. Again, in terms of geography, there's a lot of renewables going into the North Sea. So it's always been historically important for its oil reserves. But now there's a lot of large offshore wind farms being positioned there. And so there's construction offshore, and there's shipping associated with that. So the UK waters have always historically been very busy from a maritime point of view, but that is even more the case, and especially recently with COVID and everybody having to stay in their houses, because things have slackened a wee bit now, and people can't really go abroad very easily on holiday. There's a lot of people coming to the UK coast on holiday. And these often are people that don't really understand the dangers associated with it. And so we are seeing a real surge in calls. The Coast Guard is the fourth emergency service in the UK, so police, fire and the ambulance service being the other three. The fourth is the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard does take precedence for emergency calls on the coast. So they will coordinate with the other emergency services. Sometimes the emergency call goes straight to the police or the ambulance service first, and then it will be redirected to the Coast Guard. But either way, we are an emergency service that will send responders to an incident in the same way as the police do. We are specialists, so we have multiple specialisms, but search being one of them, again, one that kind of, I guess, ties in with geography. So we do missing person searches, and sort of that could be anything from a lost walker to somebody that maybe has sort of mental health or well-being issues. We do rope rescues on cliffs, and we do water rescue, but water rescue limited to a couple of 100 metres offshore. Beyond that, it then goes to the lifeboat service, and then mud rescue is the last kind of specialism. And
our cliffs and our geology around here is pretty interesting as well.
Yeah.
Going on a geography bent there.
Yeah.
And then also, maybe if you don't mind talking, you recently had wildfires out in the reserve. Yeah. Is that correct? Where did that come about? I mean, because you never think of wildfires in the UK. You hear about the big one in Australia or in California, but not in the UK. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's certainly not in the scale of the wildfires that you get in the States, or that there's been in either the Amazon or Australia or the Arctic. But I think the fact that you're seeing all these different places suffering from wildfires of one scale or another should give us an indication of how worrying this is. In the UK, land managers sometimes use controlled, and I use controlled very loosely, burning as a means of regenerating areas of vegetation, especially for livestock grazing or for the sort of rearing of game birds for sort of sports shooting. But there's also, again, a vast growth in people using the outdoors for recreational purposes. Quite a few of them have barbecues or start campfires that then get out of control. And you also get vegetation burning by homeowners or landowners to clear vegetation. And again, these can get out of control as well.
And the problem with peat is that historically up here, peat was cut by people on a very small scale to burn in their houses, and it's very good at burning long and slow,
yeah,
and giving heat. So the peatlands, although they're wet, they burn well.
There is a danger with peat if you can get fire into dry layers of peat, that it will continue to burn for long, and we're talking 10, 20, 50 years. There are areas of Borneo where peatland, but peatland under jungle. So the peat's formed in a different way to our sphagnum, but it still forms peat. And when they've been clearing forestry to create palm oil plantations, they've been using slash and burn techniques to do that, and the burning has set fire to underground reserves of peat, and those have certainly been burning for quite some time now. So once it starts burning, it's quite difficult to stop it.
And it can sort of smoulder underground and then pop back up.
The fire that we had in 2019, we don't know how it started, but it was at one point it was the largest fire in Europe, and it burned a large area of land to the north of the reserve, and just managed to get into the reserve itself. And it took the reserve staff and volunteers, local estates and keepers, and the sort of Scottish Fire and Rescue Service jointly to try and bring it under control. But we were very lucky with the weather conditions as well, that they were amenable to the way that we were trying to control it. But it highlighted for us on the reserve, and I think the Fire and Rescue Service as well, that we're not really set up in the same way as maybe in the States or Australia to deal with it. Most of our Fire and Rescue Service is orientated around structural fires and urbanized fires. So when it comes to these large scale ones, they haven't happened on that scale very often in the past. But that doesn't mean to say that we won't see it in the future. Certainly over the last couple of years, what we've been seeing is drier conditions in the spring. So especially in sort of February, March and April. And then this has been sort of leading to the correct conditions, because there's a lot of dead vegetation from the winter around at that time of year. And if that is dry, and the ground conditions don't have to be dry for it, as long as the vegetation is dry. So we get quite strong winds. We've got big open landscapes up here with quite strong winds that can dry vegetation out very easily. And if you have dry vegetation that then catches light, then we were certainly seeing the fire front moving at 4 or 5 kilometres an hour. And when it's doing that, it's very difficult to coordinate and control that on a large scale.